that we can look at it together as well. But the title of, and I hope that you heard that I'm decided to do a different topic. We were going to do something about reward for mitzvot in this world, but I'm going to set that one aside. I can come back to that if people tell me that they're very, very interested in that topic. I'm happy to do that another time. As always, by the way, I would love your suggestions for topics or things that you would like to learn about. I'm happy to try and include those in future lunches and learn, I believe is the correct way to say that. But for today, the topic that I gave for today is creative withdrawal and ethical living. The series of texts that I want to look at come from an article which I read on the bus when we were in Morocco, and a book which I started reading and I'm currently reading, which is called Ehiyeh, a Kabbalah for Tomorrow. And it is starting to delve into some of Jewish mysticism. I joked around on Shabbat that you have to be 40 years old in order to study Jewish mysticism, according to our tradition. I'm 51, so I'm a little bit late. And I don't consider myself an expert, but I am starting to delve into it more deeply, and I just want to share that learning with you and pieces of it that I find to be interesting. The question that I want to begin with today to sort of to prime our pumps and to sort of get us thinking is, what are the challenges and benefits to pulling back, okay? To withdrawal, to setting boundaries. And I'm going to sort of leave that open for interpretation, because obviously there's a number of places in life where we have the opportunity or the obligation to do this, sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally, sometimes intellectually. So I'm going to let you fill in the spaces, but I just want to explore that concept for a moment. And let me repeat the question, and then I would love for you to use the raise hand function, come off of mute, and get us started in a conversation. Again, what are the challenges to doing that? And maybe the downsides? In other words, not only what makes it difficult, but what are the things that we lose when we do that? And what are the benefits when we do so? And why is it important? Does somebody want to start our conversation? Cheryl, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Well, one thought that I have because of age is that if you pull back, you have more perspective. You're not in the situation, but you can look at the situation. And what I mean by that is emotional and physical. Like, I was thinking that I'm at a stage of life where I'm reflecting on life and looking and trying to learn what it all, put it together and what it all means. And it helps to be retired. So for example, you're pulled back. So I would start with that.
Thank you. Yes, we get a certain perspective, both physically. If we step back, we're able to see things that we can't see because we're right there. And then emotionally, one of the things that psychologists teach is that when your emotions are high, then your ability to think goes down. Literally the brain can't do both at the same time. And so if emotionally you're able to step away, then it enables you to be able to think about the situation more, right? So there's that perspective that you can get both physically and emotionally. Susanna, go ahead.
I think that when we tax ourselves too heavily or take on too many things or are ill-equipped to help, it's possible to cause more damage. So not helping sometimes is the best thing we can do. Like easy example would be little kids putting on shoes that if every time you jump in to help them, they never actually learn, and that it's important to have some discomfort. Harder example would be like with addiction, that someone has to get through it on their own in some regards and make those choices individually. So I think it's a tricky one because there's also this sense of, like, I think the child would need to have enough support to know that the help is there. So it's kind of like a duality of holding the space that there's the capacity to have enough resourcing to tolerate being stepped back from, but also to build that mastery by having to build something on our own, or have the opportunity to learn a new skill, or come past whatever mountain and defeat whatever demons on our own.
Thank you. I think that's a really important observation, that sometimes by remaining, let's say, involved or remaining in it, we actually can even do damage, right? By maybe messing up the situation, or by not facilitating somebody else's independence, right? And somebody else's learning and growth, right? So it's actually a really important, and by the way, just to show my hand a little bit, I gave this title, the title of this session, Creative Withdrawal and Ethical Living, right? And I do think that there is, part of ethical living, part of being a good person is, as Susanna, as you said very thoughtfully, navigating that tension between how do I try to help someone by being involved, but also how do I know when to step back because being involved is actually not helpful, right? And those are tricky things to know. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, similar to Susanna's comments. I think for me, I'm always in search of the awareness that of when I need to pause before moving forward. So I think of, when I saw your title, for me, a pause is a kind of momentary creative withdrawal that gives me a chance to consider whether my urgency to move in a certain direction is warranted or not, whether I really have all the information I need, whether I've listened well enough to the situation or the person. And so it's about, the awareness of that moment. And then just more recently, and because I'm involved in a Musar class, and we're focused this week on our first character development piece around anava, or humility. And some of the readings that we were given to consider were around anti-racist activity and the importance of pulling back, and in order to, as a white person, in order to make space for the voices that are always the last ones to be heard. So it's a different kind of creative withdrawal, to make space for, something that might not come to be heard otherwise.
Great. By the way, just Viktor Frankl sort of very famously said that the place of freedom is in the space between a thank you, is in the space between, I forget exactly how he puts it, but when something happens and your response to it, right? It's in that pause, because while you can't determine what happens to you, you are free to determine how you respond to it, and how you understand it. And so thinking about that as a moment of withdrawal, and thinking about it as a place of freedom, right? That's a place of freedom for me, is I think really productive. Errol, and then let's turn to some of our texts.
Okay, 2 points I was thinking of. One that's sort of very close to home is when I've been involved in organizations for many years, scientific organizations, and people still want to keep me involved. My feeling is it's time for me to step out and let some of the younger generation move up. You know, I don't need it on my CV anymore, they do, and let them move up. But the other point was going back to Cheryl's comment is, when you step back from something, you can remove yourself from the action, from the topic, and you can start looking at something objectively rather than subjectively. It gives you a whole different viewpoint, because it's not how will this affect me, but how is this affecting what's going on? And to be able to switch from subjective to objective is very important.
My only slight philosophical maybe addendum or to that would be, I'm going to say it allows us to move from subjectivity to being more objective. I'm not sure that anybody achieves pure objectivity.
Right.
I think as a scientist, you would agree with that. But it does allow us to be more objective.
Not even ivory soap is 100% pure.
Always a good way of putting it, Errol. I appreciate that. And the other thing which you said, one of the ways that I think about that, my brother was the English major at the University of Maryland, and at some point taught me this. I don't know how true it is or whatever, but generally it works. That the medieval king had three weapons, three tools: the sword to conquer, the staff to lead, and the grail to pass on. Okay, and it was all right. So the king has the sword in order to take the throne, the staff, which is a different tool that you use to lead, and then the grail to pass on. And it was always the search for the quest and the futile search for the Holy Grail, always so difficult to obtain. Why? Because the Grail was about passing on leadership. It was about getting other people involved. And Errol, to your point, I think it's very challenging. You demonstrate a lot of wisdom in knowing that other people need to take the reins and need to have it on their CV, as you said. But I think that for many people, that process of letting go is a challenge, right? And that's why it was always the quest, the search for the Holy Grail, but rarely was it found. So we're going to turn now to some sources. I want to say welcome to Bart. Great to see you. And I'm going to put into the chat one more time, because if you weren't on the call before, then you don't get the chats that were there from before. But I'm also going to share my screen. And I want to just start out by learning. I'm going to share my screen. Maybe, why is it not showing up? Let's see if I can share my screen. All right, let me try this. Can you see my text now? Great, okay. So I want to read or maybe just so I hear less of my voice, Cheryl, can I ask you to come off of mute and to read? I'm going to read the Hebrew, and then you can read the English of the first two sources. Okay, the first source is the very beginning of the Torah in Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim, and I'll put my cursor there. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. V'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu v'choshech al pnei tehom. V'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. Cheryl, would you read the English?
When God began to create heaven and the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water.
Okay. This translation, by the way, I think it's a correct translation. I think it's a good translation. It is not the King James translation. Can somebody tell me, just from memory, how does King James translate the very first words of the Torah?
It says, in the beginning.
Yes. So it reads it, and for centuries and centuries, these words were translated and understood as what's called creatio ex nihilo, that what you're learning is in the beginning, right? God created the heaven and earth. In other words, we are reading the story from the Big Bang, or whatever, however you want to put it, from the, sorry, Harold, right? From the very, it's just shorthand, from the very first moment of creation, right? And this translation is actually more accurate because of the gray sheet, because of what kind of word it is. It's a gerund, and so it's more accurately translated as when God began to create, or something like that. But for now, we're gonna go with it. Cheryl, go ahead and read. There's a person named Rabbi Yehuda Leon Ashkenazi. He was a French rabbi who was in Paris in the 1950s. He grew up. He grew up in, I think, in Paris, and was there during the war, during the time of Vichy France, and wonderful teacher. He was a contemporary of Emmanuel Levinas, and I want to read how he understands this section. Okay, go ahead, Cheryl.
Why immediately after in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is everything suddenly waste and void and darkness in the second verse? In the narrative.
So I just want to, focus on that for a second, okay? If you translate this as in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, okay? That seems to be a process of making order, okay? Creation begins and God creates the heavens and the earth, okay? And that the question that he asks is, if we begin with order, why is the second verse, right? If we're reading this temporally, why is the second verse now saying, and the earth, which God just created, right, was wild and waste, right? And there was darkness on the face of the deep. Okay. No, it's like we seem to be going backwards and not forwards. That's the crux of his question. Okay. Again, you don't have to read the first two verses that way, but I think it's possible to read them that way, and he's trying to understand what's behind that. Okay, go ahead, Cheryl.
In the narrative, God is not creating ex nihilo, something out of nothing, but the reverse. Out of something, God is making nothing.
Whoa, wow, hold on. What he's going to explain a little bit more, but what is this? What does this mean? God is not creating something out of nothing, but God is creating out of something. God is creating nothing. How is he? Sorry, stop. Okay, all right. How is he? How is he fitting that back into Genesis, into the verses? Somebody just explain it for me, just to make sure we're getting that. How this reading is working.
I mean, it seems like it's kind of the snakes that eat their own tail. That it's saying that the something and the nothing come from each other. Like in the
Okay,
word.
but how is it coming out of the verses? What is making him sit? Elazar?
So at first he's saying, or at first the Torah says, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, but then it says there was null and void, waste and void and darkness. So it looks like there had to have been something, but that waste and void and darkness is the explanation of that something. And the waste and void and darkness is essentially nothing.
Okay.
So there's this thing that's been created, but the significance of that thing or the content of that thing is nothing. I don't know if that helps explain.
So I want to sharpen this a little bit more because he's saying something a little bit more radical. Okay.
So
The way.
I'm sorry. Is it saying that in creating the space for the earth, God had to create nothing out of something for there to be space for earth to be created?
I think we're getting closer. Okay. I think he's reading this as first God created something. Okay. What was the something in the first verse? The heavens and the earth. And the way that we normally understand the second verse is that essentially, well, at that time when God created the heavens and the earth, there was pre-existing wild and waste, right? There was pre-existing darkness, there was pre-existing nothingness. And so we're sort of, it's almost a, what's the term in movies when you reflect on something in the past?
Prequel?
Not a prequel, a
Flashback?
Flashback.
right? So the way we normally read this is verse 2 is a flashback telling you more about verse 1. Right? At the time when God created the heavens and the earth, right? And that's actually how this translation works, right? At the time when God was creating the heavens and the earth, flashback, there was nothing and void, etc., etc. And then we're going to move forward, and the actual creation of heaven and earth is then going to take place. Okay, so reading it that way is a way of reading God is creating ex nihilo, from nothingness, from the waste and wild and the darkness, right? God creates order. He is reading this as the opposite. In other words, God actually creates order and then creates disorder. Okay. In other words, verse 2 temporally is not a flashback. It actually comes after what happens in verse 1. Okay. Errol, and then I'm going to have Cheryl continue reading because maybe Manitou can explain it better than I am.
Okay. Well, the way I look at it, it can also be interpreted as when God created the heavens and the earth as a concept. Now he's bringing the concept to reality, to actuality.
Okay, great. In which case, again, the thought process of verse 1, right, and then verse 2 is a flashback before, there's nothing has happened yet. Okay. Manitou again is reading this as something happened in verse 1, order, something related to order. And now, out of something, God is actually creating nothing. Okay, so Cheryl, go ahead, keep reading. In other words, let's see if you can explain it better than I did.
In other words, the contraction and concealing of God's light to create the empty space, the place for the world to exist, also create a world of darkness, waste, and wild, an unfinished world, a mix of good and evil that needs fixing. God's making that empty space and not finishing it intentionally allows for this chaos in order to give a place to human beings, a moral place to share in the process of creation. As writers, we're all in the position of the creator in the Kabbalah. We have to condense the vast array of our thoughts in order for our audience to be able to receive.
So let's leave aside the last part, which is a whole conversation about what's called rhetoric and the relationship between speaker and audience and things like that. But let's just look at this part. In the contraction and concealing of God's light to create the empty space, the place for the world to exist, also create a world of waste and wild. And in making that empty space and not finishing it allows for this chaos in order to give a place to human beings to share in the process of creation. The vision of, and some of you may have heard this before, the way that Lurianic Kabbalah understands creation as having taken place is through something called Tzimtzum. Okay, Tzimtzum is contraction or withdrawal, and the basic idea is that in the beginning, all there was God. Right? There's nothing else except for God. Right? Another way of putting this is that God was Yachid Ba'olamo, that God was actually alone in God's world. Right? Because God was the world, there was no world, there was only God, there was oneness. And in order for there to be creation, God had to withdraw from a place and have there be a place where there wasn't God. And I would almost say kibiyachol, as if such a thing is possible. Okay, but this is the way that the Kabbalists understood how creation took place. And let me just stop there and Manitou is saying that is intentional. It's intentional to create chaos because God wanted to give to human beings the opportunity to participate in creation. Okay? So let me just stop here. We can look at some more sources about this, but I'm just sort of curious, what do you make of that? And does it relate at all to some of the things that we were talking about in terms of withdrawing or setting boundaries that we opened up with? Lori?
I was thinking about getting out of the way. In terms of what Susanna was saying about sometimes helping and facilitating is not helping and facilitating, but letting the other do its own activity. So getting out of the way.
And
I was imagining God getting out of the way.
Right, that is how the Kabbalists describe the creation, right? that God needs to get out of the way. God needs to do things soon, to withdraw, right, in order for, and that is actually, while sometimes it feels, it can feel like a punishment, it can feel negative. It is necessary in order for other people to literally exist, right? In the case of God, in order for there to be existence. By the way, the word existence comes from ex and stare, which means to stand outside of, right? And so if God is everywhere and you want existence to take place, there has to be a place that's outside of God. And that sort of echoes into a lot of relationships and into and you know the basic, one of the basic ideas of Kabbalah is that in understanding or thinking about God this way, that these are processes and ideas that echo in everything, right? They echo in every human being. They echo in communities. They echo in actually in all of life. Right? One of the Kabbalists will talk about how creation and revelation are actually not separate, right? That the natural world actually reveals something about God and God's processes. Other thoughts or reactions to this? So let me move on for a second, okay? I'm going to share my screen again, and I want to just show you a spirotic chart, okay? Here it is, okay? So I'm not going to go into all of this because I'm not an expert in all of this, but this is just a little bit of an introduction. The rabbis, the way that mysticism works, Jewish mysticism works, is through this map of what are called sfirot. By the way, can you hear me okay? Is my microphone consistent? Okay.
It's sort of going in,
Could be
it's
loud.
going in and out.
A little bit.
Okay. Tell me, I just did something that maybe will help, but tell me if, okay. So where did the sfirot come from? If you read the first chapter of the book of Genesis, you'll see that the words Yehi, God speaks and says, "Let there be." I think they occur 9 times, and then there's like a 10th that gets counted for something. The rabbis will say in Pirkei Avot that the world was created with 10 utterances. In other words, God spoke 10 times. I think you find it 9 plus 1, but God speaks 10 times and the world comes into being. So that's some of the textual basis for the 10 sfirot. And the 10 sfirot are, I don't even know what I mean when I say this, but like aspects of the Godhead, they are emanations, they're parts of God. For now, let's just use them as a thinking tool, okay? Like I said, for the mystics, for the Kabbalists, this chart is in understanding God, or in sort of using this to think about God. You know, the idea is that you come to an understanding of yourself and of the physical world and of reality, okay? So the first sphira is called Keter. Keter means crown. The sphira is also called Ein Sof, which means there is no end, okay? It's just absolute eternity and infinity. And one of the, and this is sort of the least accessible of any of any of the Sfirot. It's the one that's the farthest away from our experience. Some people call it, Errol, you actually mentioned this idea that the first verse of Genesis is God's thought process, and then like the doing comes later. So some of the Kabbalists will say that the Keter is actually the divine mind, right? And there's nothing except for divine thought there. It's it's beyond existence because it's beyond anything that's outside of God. It's beyond anything physical, obviously, and it's even maybe it's beyond time because it's sort of prior to everything. And the word will here is just, I think, associated with it because once there is an awakening within the divine mind, then once there's a little bit of will, then something happens. Okay. If it was pure thought, right, then there would be nothing else because there's just thinking. And the next thing that happens, okay, if we can say this, is chokhmah, which is translated, it means wisdom, beginning, a point, well, now I just want to read a text about this, okay, about that transition from nothingness to chokhmah, okay? So, Marguerite, do you feel like reading today? No, not really. Elazar, will you read where it says wisdom is the end? And when you read the word wisdom, I just want to make sure you understand that in this particular, by the way, this is Nachmanides' commentary on a book called Sefer Yetzirah, which is an early Kabbalistic work. When you read the word wisdom, you need to read not just regular old wisdom, but he's talking about the Sfirah of Chokhmah. Okay, so he's talking about this area, this Sfirah. Okay, so what about wisdom? Go ahead.
Wisdom is the end of what you can ponder in thought. For Keter, the highest Sfirah, fills more than the mind can conceive. Okay,
so can you try and translate that from English to English? What did you just read?
I would have said beginning. I don't know if I can, because under Chokhmah was beginning. So Keter is this overflowing. Can you go back to the text for a second? This overflowing conception, mind full of knowing, I guess. Wisdom, he says, is the end of what you can ponder or maybe explain of that knowing. But I don't understand how that connects to the beginning in terms of Chokhmah. So,
well, let's do this. I should keep reading a little bit more. It contracted. So it here again is wisdom. Okay, wisdom contracted. Go ahead.
It contracted the essence of its presence into a handbreadth, and darkness appeared over everything, for the absence of light is darkness.
So, and I just want to link this again to here, okay? Darkness is over the face of the deep, okay? And according to Manitou, first there was something, and then, right, like according to this, basically, there might have, in this first verse, there might have been light and God everywhere, even though we haven't read about the creation of light, okay? But think of this as Keter, there's sort of everything, and then afterwards, nothing, right? Afterwards, there's darkness. And so what he's saying is that when wisdom happens, okay, there's a contraction, and then there's darkness, and darkness appears over everything, for the absence of light is darkness. And you remember I said that this is a point, okay, that with Chokhmah, there's a point. Everything contracts to a point. Then, keep going, then from the source of all.
Then from the source of all, it emanated the bright light of wisdom in 32 paths, each path penetrating the darkness. With them, the engraver engraved the darkness.
Okay. Ooh. By the way, all mysticism is framed in paradox and hard to understand language, and that's purposeful, right? Because part of what they're doing is trying to explain things that are in some ways beyond explanation. Okay. Can somebody else sort of translate from English to English? Like, what do you, or do you have any observations? Harold, I'm going to pick on you for a second, right? Because you and I read together a book called God and the Big Bang, okay?
Right.
And for those of you who haven't read it, maybe somebody can find it and put a link to it on Amazon or somewhere else. It's a very, very interesting and good book. And it was written by Daniel Matt, who's one of the world's leading scholars of Kabbalah. And my dad of blessed memory, who I've been thinking about a lot this week, got a chance to learn with him at Camp Ramah, California, maybe 15 years ago, when he gave a lecture about the similarities and differences between cosmology and Kabbalah. And Daniel Matt, as my dad said, he had the physics, right? He actually does understand, at least at that point, he understood the physics. The physics may have changed in the last 20 years, probably has. But what's interesting is this idea of it contracted the essence of its presence into a handbreadth, right? Matt, I think, would say it's just very interesting that a book from 1,000 years ago was conceiving of the moment of creation as beginning with, if I can blend terms here recklessly, with what we might call a singularity, okay? This idea that everything sort of collapses into something infinitesimally small, okay? That's what we, that Chokhmah is a point. Harold, do you want to weigh in here, or have I been reckless and dangerous enough?
I'll just weigh in briefly to say, yeah, when I read the book too, it was he makes a very striking case for parallels between modern cosmology and the Kabbalah view. But there's another thing that struck me just reading this now, which is that this is also describing, at least what I've experienced, as kind of the human process of creation. In my case, creating science, which is that what often happens is, you're kind of struggling and lost and nothing seems very clear. And then there's a certain point at which things come together and you understand this little bit of the problem. And then you use that little bit of the problem that you understand to go out and explain, to try and explain all of it. So this is a description of kind of human creativity as well.
I really appreciate that, and I think, again, I'm enjoying this book with Arthur Green. By the way, we're over the next couple of years, I'd like to bring Art Green. I think we may be able to do that, to bring him to Bethel to do a weekend. But part of what he talks about with Kabbalah is, to me, mysticism is not so interesting as sort of a thought experiment. and my concern about mysticism is that it ends up just sort of being a self-absorbed, language that it sort of turns upon itself. But I do find it really helpful and interesting when I see, this idea that what the mystics are trying to do is to describe, in describing God, to describe patterns and echoes that express themselves in each human being and in relationships and in communities and in human processes. And I think that's a great observation, right? That, wow, when I create, right, I go through a process of darkness, right? When darkness covers light, and by the way, I think we struggle against that, right? I think we resist, getting lost, and there's no substitute for getting lost, okay? And actually, in today's world with constant social media, just time for uninterrupted quiet is very difficult to come by. But all of the science and everybody will tell you it's critical, right, for human creativity and for growth, right? And then once you have that little point, right, it manifests itself. Please don't ask me why 32 paths and not 10 paths or 14 paths or 17 paths. I don't know where the number 32 is coming from, somebody, but there is this idea of there's a point and then boom, right? That actually is really helpful with a whole other set of things. So Susanna, Sarah, and Errol, and then we'll hear from Shabtai Sheftel Horwitz.
Just in terms of translation to English, I was thinking that it reminds me of like a cup overflowing, and the way that sometimes when there's more than we can conceive, like in our conscious mind, it can hit areas that we might not realize and can feel like those synchronicities are just like happenstances and that perceived of that. And I know you said not to ask why 32. My thoughts of 32 were that it's 2 to the 5th power. And I was thinking how 5 is half of 10. We have 10 generations in Genesis and those sorts of things. I don't know that that actually means anything, but that's what came up for me.
Love it. Love it. See, I love mathematical mind going in place. I was not going to go. All right, Sarah, go ahead.
I'm tickled by the language of the hand breadth, because to me, it was the image of how I can stand outside and I can put my hand up to cover the sun. Literally, this enormous object that's right, millions of billions of miles away, right? I can put my hand up as if to make the sun disappear, to light go away. And yet, of course, it's still there. And there is a controversy of, or a discussion among the rabbis about how God can actually, while God appears to withdraw from this space, he can't actually withdraw. God's actually present everywhere. Even in the place where God has withdrawn from, God is still present. Just like the sun is still present when we, can put our hand over it.
Well, and I'll say 2 things about that. Number one, in when you place your hand in front of the sun, what does it allow you to do? It allows you to see. In other words, you actually see more clearly by blocking out light than by being flooded with light, okay? And I think that that's part of what this is relating, is that in order for there to be something other than God, right, there has to be this process of, let me just read it again. It contracted the essence of its presence into a handbreadth, and darkness appeared over everything, right? For the absence of light is darkness. You have to take away the light actually in order to be able to see something different, right? And then from the source of all, from that handbreadth, from that point, it emanated the bright light of wisdom, right? wisdom being a kind of, and here, chokhmah, right? If you use it in Yiddish, right? The guy has chokhmah, right? Another way to say it might be he has sechel, right? It means he has common sense. This is a guy who may not be able to read, all of the encyclopedia, but he knows how to screw in a light bulb. Okay, it's a knowing of a different kind, which is not intellectual. It's a knowing of doing. Right? There's a person who knows, and there's a certain type of knowing that you get when you block out the sun and there's like darkness of the sun, but then like, oh, there are all these other things I can see, right, that I wouldn't have been able to see before. Let me just read the Shabtai Sheftel Horowitz. This is 16th, 17th century, and then I'll hear from Errol and somebody else had their hand, and Harold, okay? Before the creation of the world, Ein Sof withdrew into its essence from itself to itself within itself. Okay, again, the language of paradox here. It left an empty space within its essence in which it could emanate and create. Okay, so Ein Sof withdraws from itself to itself within itself. Okay, and what's being described here is the movement from Keter to Chokhmah, right? Leaving an empty space within its essence, okay, in which it could emanate and create. Okay, by the way, when the emanation takes place, right, when that light goes out in 32 paths, there has to be a vessel for receiving that light. And the vessel for receiving the light is called Binah, okay? And the light moves, but there's lots of sexual things to this as well. The rabbis, anyway, are pretty obvious, but this being womb, right? It's the upper womb, the palace, understanding. That's where all of that wisdom goes, right? In this model, okay. Earl and then Harold.
Okay, when I read the phrase, wisdom phrase, for Keter fills more than the mind can conceive, it reminds me of a quote from Shakespeare. I'm not a Shakespearean, so I'm just paraphrasing. There is more on heaven and earth, Horatio, than what the mind, I don't remember the exact wording, but so essentially Shakespeare took that idea and ran with it.
Yeah, and again, I think that those connections, the mysticism here, it's not surprising that a great author, right, at some point expressed these ideas, right? It's trying to use words to name things that are beyond words. But it's coming from a sense that there is an element of reality out there that when we sort of close our eyes, and actually what's interesting is in Green's book, he has like some meditations where he sort of encourages people to meditate and to think about these things. But like, can you close your eyes and to think about a realm of existence where it's only thinking and where there's only God's mind and it's only contemplation, right? And, again, it's not what we walk around the world with when we order coffee at Starbucks, but it is trying to point towards those things. Harold?
I wanted to make a comment going back more to the beginning of our discussion, which is that, in terms of my experience of doing creative things in physics, it's not really what you said, that you start out in darkness. I don't start out in darkness. It feels like gray to me, and it's very uncomfortable. You're confused, and then when things start to move and you start to understand things, there is this separation between what you understand and what you don't understand. Suddenly it becomes clear where your understanding is and where it isn't. Well, before well, before it was really all mixed up and chaotic. So that's very much even more parallel to what we were saying at the beginning.
Say just fill that in. Why is it more parallel?
Well, you're saying that in the first phrase of Genesis, that in the second verse there was sort of darkness, and the earth and darkness were being created from something. It wasn't the beginning, right? You started out with God, and then God had to sort of contract, leaving darkness and light.
Great.
Yeah.
So I want to move on and just read a little bit of how Arthur Green articulates this. Bart, do you want to read for me? Out of Keter emerges Chokhmah. And you got to come off of mute.
Out of Keter emerges Chokhmah, or wisdom, the first and finest point of real existence. All things, souls, and moments of time that are ever to be now exist within a primal point, at once infinitesimally small and great beyond measure.
And let me just stop for Harold. You turned your camera off, but I just want to ask you, as our resident physicist who knows more about this, talk about the comparison to what's called a singularity.
Yeah, so I mean, a singularity in theory of in cosmology refers to a point in space-time at which things aren't continuous, and so it's thought that the Big Bang started with a singularity, but we don't really know because we can't see back after a certain point. Does that help?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting here is that there's a sense that all things, right? In other words, physical matter. He's going to use the language here of souls, right? Of which I don't think science is, sort of, okay, maybe not taking that language, but moments of time, right? In other words, this is a collapsing of time, because I don't know, does the language of even saying before the Big Bang like make sense? Like, can there be a before?
Well, I mean, if you think that we're in a universe which is oscillating, so it contracts to Big Bang, then expands, then contracts to Big Bang and expands, then there can be a before. But from a scientific point of view, it's not really a scientific question what happened before the Big Bang. It's I would say it's outside of the domain of science.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. Bard, so keep going. Like mystics everywhere.
Like mystics everywhere, Kabbalists love the language of paradox, a way of showing how inadequate words really are to describe this reality. The move from Keter to Chokhmah, the first step in the primal process, is a transition from nothingness to being, from pure potential to the first point of real existence. The Kabbalah.
And this idea of potential, I think he's wrapping up that Keter is a world of entire, that's completely potential, right? Nothing has, quote, happened yet, right? And it's a way of sort of trying to map out, we understand that there's a reality to potential, right? Like you can sort of point to, here are all these different possibilities. That person has a lot of potential, but nothing's happened yet, right? All right, sorry to interrupt, keep going.
The Kabbalists are fond of describing it by their own reading of Job 28:12, the opening of Job's hymn to wisdom. Wisdom comes from nothingness. All the variety of existence is contained within Chokhmah, ready to begin the journey forward. The primal point contains within it the potential of all that is to be. Can I comment that at the very beginning, in the first quote, there was a point that the absence of light is darkness, but the reverse, the absence of darkness is not necessarily light. And I think it could be, if you will, potential, or the contents of everything that is to be, will to be, and was. I think that's, I don't know where I'm going with this, but another paradox.
You're reminding me of what Harold said, right? Which is that maybe the absence of light, it's not darkness, it's just that gray, right? I mean, you know, gray maybe has a little bit of light or whatever, but like, yes, I think that trying to describe this as a pregnant darkness, you know, a darkness of possibility. So I'll read this second paragraph. Chokhmah is also the primordial teaching, the inner mind of God, the Torah that exists, but prior, that exists first prior to the birth of words and letters. As being exists first in this ultimately concentrated form, so does truth or wisdom. Okay, so it's getting at this idea that we have a Torah, but before there's a written Torah, right, before there's even dark fire on white fire, or a written Torah and oral Torah, there's like this Torah that comes before, right, which is just based on truth and wisdom. Here we begin to see the Kabbalist's insistence that creation and revelation are twin processes. Existence and language, the real and the nominal, emerging together from the hidden mind of God. Right, so we think of, there's creation over here, material, and then there's revelation, which is sort of the spirit, and the Kabbalists are saying, no, those actually aren't different. The Torah is wrapped up in existence, right? It's wrapped up in nature. It's wrapped up in the universe.
Like DNA?
In the DNA.
Like, so kind of the combined.
Yep. As the primal point of existence, Chokhmah is symbolized by the letter Yud. Okay. The smallest of the letters, by the way, here's a letter Yud, just way at the bottom. Okay. It's the, whoops, where did it go? The smallest of the letters. The first point from which all other letters will be written. So existence, I don't know if we can like zoom in on a Yud, okay, but it's like the very, very top, right? Here, let me do it this way.
The third line up in that paragraph, that final sentence has one, or has one like.
Yes, okay, there we go. I don't know if I can enlarge this though. I really wanna.
It's like an apostrophe.
Yeah, hold on for 1 second. I'm gonna see some of my other notes for a second. Hold on. I'm just gonna do this for fun. I'm gonna go Hebrew, and then I'm gonna do a Yud. And then I'm gonna, come on. There. I'll blow it up. And then I'm gonna do it to a better font, okay? So this is sort of saying that all of existence starts from right there, okay? Up here is Keter, okay? It's just pure something other. And then there's the little point, which is the very, very little itty bitty top of the Yud. That's the top of the Yud. That's where it all begins. And that's where all writing begins, okay? All of the Torah, the text and the commentary added to it in every generation, indeed, all of human wisdom is contained within a single yud, the yud written like that is the first letter of the name of God. The upper tip of the yud is said to point towards Keter, itself designated by the Aleph, or the divine name Ehyeh, right? And the Aleph, right, which is how God begins the Ten Commandments and says Anochi. Aleph doesn't have a sound, right? Aleph is the it's the pre-sound, okay? So let me stop for a moment, and actually, I want to look at. Let me go back to one more thing, okay? And with this, we'll finish up. I sort of skirted by this point that Handelman makes in the article, and she says, it's actually her who's saying this, not Manitou. She says, as writers, where did it go? As writers, come on, there we go. As writers, we're all in the position of the creator in the Kabbalah. We have to condense the vast array of our thoughts in order for our audience to be able to receive. Okay? So for me, as a rabbi, right, what this means is it's contained in every time somebody says to me, Rabbi, keep it short. Okay? And what they're saying is, look, I'm interested in what you have to say, but I have a limited time span. And if you don't make this, if you don't keep it short, then I'm not going to be able to understand. Okay. And in a larger context, what this is saying is, hey, I, as the audience, need you to leave a space for me to give human beings a moral place to share in the process of creation. Okay, I as an audience, I need, like, I can't take on every single thought in the world that you've ever had. Okay, I need, in order for me to participate in this, I need there to be room. And you as the author, you as the speaker, you as the teacher you have to cut out all, like, a bunch of other stuff in order to make this, in order for there to be room for me. Okay. It's one of the reasons that I start out these lunch and learns by asking you a question, right? Because my model of teaching is not where I'm speaking a lot and then you're just learning everything that I've read somewhere, or, you know, learning a text and sort of opening up your heads and pouring in knowledge. Okay, that to me is not education. That's not how teaching works. Teaching is a holy dialogue. It's a holy back and forth process. And I start with the question because I'm actually trying to do that process of making room. So I think that I think it's true in, as she says, for writers and teachers, but I also think that this is just, you know, as I've been saying before, this is part of what it means to be an ethical human being. I'm going to go back to the title I gave this, which is Creative Withdrawal and Ethical Living. Part of what it means to be an ethical human being is to know, how do I make space, holy and moral space, for other people? Okay, that can be anything from, when I'm in a group of people, am I talking too much? Right? In other words, am I looking around and being aware that that there's a whole bunch of needs here, right? And I can participate, right? And I have a piece of that, but also I need to make room for others. Right? It can be in a, when raising a child, right? Am I letting my child fall down, right? Am I letting them have the space that they need to learn, right? Or am I jumping in and helicopter parenting and fixing everything? It can be in a love relationship, right? In a loving relationship, as my teacher once said, half times a half equals a quarter, but 1 times 1 equals 1. Each person needs to be fully themselves, all right? And part of what I need when I'm in a love relationship, I need to allow that person to be fully themselves outside of me, right? And I need to be fully myself outside of them, in order for the possibility of relationship, right? Because if there are 2 people who are fully enmeshed in each other, then it's not relationship, right? It's sort of the collapsing into each other, right? So I think that there's this idea of ethical withdrawal and creative withdrawal. What I wanted to give to you today is sort of first of all, an introduction to a little bit of Kabbalah. And I wanted it to be relevant, and I wanted it to be a meaningful tool for thinking through what does it mean to be a human being, and how do I walk through the world? So let me ask, it's 12:53. I would love to just know, I don't know, was that comprehensible? Did any of it make sense? Was it helpful? Should we do this a lot more? Was it nice to sprinkle this in, but like, let's, go on to other things? Or do you have any other reactions and thoughts? Let me now withdraw and try to create a moral and creative space. Hunter?
I think it's, am I muted?
Nope, you're on.
I think it's really hard, and I think I need to go over it again and again. So I would like to continue with this because I'm really interested in it, but it's very, very difficult. But I want to persist.
Okay, all right, so it's worthwhile. That's good to know. Thank you.
I really enjoy studying this stuff. I agree with Hunter's assertion that it can be difficult. And I'm wondering if, I know you mentioned one book you recommend, or if there's other ones, if they're like, I'm like, oh, maybe I could read something and while Marguerite or while Hunter are and talk to them about it and also grow in those ways. Just if there's other avenues to also have those 32 paths coming out.
Yes, so Elazar, I thank you for putting into, I think he scooted off. Oh no, there you are. He put into the chat the link to God and the Big Bang. There's no secret to the book that I'm reading. It's called Eheyeh, a Kabbalah Tomorrow. Art Green, maybe Elazar can find the link to that one too and post it in the chat. And there's, I think there's lots of other stuff out there. Let me just give one caveat, Susanna. I appreciate you asking that question. I'm going to be very blunt. There is a lot of crap out there when it comes to Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. There's a lot of junk. There's a lot of selling holy water and red strings and what I'll just call cheap Baba Mises. And I would say, I feel very comfortable recommending to you things by Daniel Matt and Art Green. But as you explore this, I think one of the reasons that the rabbis are very clear, they're very concerned about people studying mysticism for precisely those reasons, that it can very quickly become cheapened, it can very quickly become magical, superstitious Baba Mises that's disconnected from the Jewish living. And I would just say, please, I hope this doesn't sound egotistical, but please follow me. Ask if there are things that you come upon, ask me about them, because I actually think that this is a type of learning and knowledge that I think that the rabbi's concern was well-founded, and we have not evolved beyond, beyond crap being part of what's out there in the Jewish world. Other thoughts and takeaways and responses? Anything else? Can someone, if you want, volunteer, sort of, what is one way that, one thing that you're going to think about, or one way that this might impact your day moving forward? Elazar?
Right. So this actually goes back to one of the opening questions. It gives me a good framework for how to think about my life in some ways. During the pandemic, past couple of years, I've done a lot of personal tzimtzum, beyond just pandemic living. I've intentionally contracted things originally to get away from things that weren't working for me and things that I didn't believe in. But then the step after that isn't just to go out and do everything again. It's to explore and define and pursue what does work for me and what I do believe in. And so this opening conversation provides some structure.
Great. Maybe one more? Hunter?
We haven't talked much about art, but I see ways to explore this topic through art, because I know there are a lot of times when you talk about the void and then something coming from the void, where I'll want to be doing something and be trying to really get what it is I want out of it. And then all of a sudden, when I'm totally removed, it comes to me how to pursue something. And I really like to renew my thought that I don't have to have the answer immediately, that I can work through it. And sometimes let it go and it will work through for me.
Well, thank you all very, very much. We will do another lunch and learn. By the way, I'm gonna stop the recording here.